On 10 and WBT.
Huh? It's 5:05 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start off with breaking news this morning. The individual who oversees North Carolina's rebuilding efforts after Hurricane Matthew and Florence is apparently no longer employed by the state. Laura Hogshead is no longer employed by the North Carolina Department of Public Safety in her role as the director of the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. That's according to the department's chief communication officer, Jody Donaldson, in an announcement late yesterday. Donaldson said Pryor Gibbons, who works for the governor, is currently serving as the interim director of the North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery. It was earlier this week on Monday when Hogshead faced tough questions from lawmakers during an over 2-hour oversight committee hearing that took place at the General Assembly. Her leadership and the program's unbelievably slow process has drawn criticism for years. I'll take you back to Monday on up in the General Assembly when you had representatives asking for her resignation, specifically Representative Brandon Jones from Columbus County.
Looks like it's going to cost about $980 million. You guys came to us for $530. We've already talked inflation. We've done that. The original budget was for $530 million thereabout. So it's about a $450 million difference now. You just said you were at fault. So are you going to admit to this committee today that this is your fault that this NCOR is in this situation?
I should have been watching more carefully, but I want to make sure we're talking about the right numbers. What we requested of the federal government after Florence was $1.1 billion.
Are you telling the committee, I want to get very clear right now, very specific, is it your fault where we are with the numbers?
Yes, sir. This is my.
Will you turn in your resignation today, please?
That is for the governor and for DPS.
I'm asking you, as this committee, having met with you several times, and I am frustrated, you can tell, will you turn in your resignation today if you're admitting your fault?
Sir, I believe that we have done what we can to come to solve the problem.
Yes or no, please?
No, sir. I will not resign.
Okay. Then committee, I think we've got a lot of work to do, but.
That was on Monday. She said she would not resign, working at the discretion of the governor. We're not sure this morning whether she resigned from that position or was asked to leave in regards to the governor's wishes in leading that department. The NCOR has been under an incredible amount of scrutiny. We'll continue to track that throughout the day today and have details over on our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:08 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got a brand new poll this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour coming out of the 2024 election cycle. To get more details on that, it's my pleasure to welcome back the editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal, Donna King, to go over some of those details with us this morning. Unlike our past polls, Donna, where we've polled individuals and said, hey, who are you voting for in this race and that race, this kind of looks at the aftermath of the election cycle. And the question I want to touch on first is, do people think that the nation is heading in the right direction or wrong direction after the election cycle? And it seems like the Trump win has people pretty enthusiastic nationwide about the future of this country.
Yeah, this latest poll, you're right. It's a pulse check on where people are coming after this election, especially as we roll into the holidays, holiday spending, that kind of thing. This actually found pretty good news, I think. So voters felt more optimistic about the direction of the country. 48%, that's a 28-point bump over October, say that the country is headed in the right direction. And about half that, about 50% or 12 points up, feel like North Carolina is now headed in the right direction. So, to me, people may be just breathing a sigh of relief that the election is over, regardless of what they think the results are. But generally, what this is telling us is that people feel like we are turning a corner after the election. And that's got to be good news for perhaps, the shopping season and going into the end of the year.
Well, and I think especially when you look at the national right direction, wrong direction, the Trump victory and that gap, that margin that you talk about from 27% in September up to almost 48.5% now, shows that people, regardless of whether they liked Trump or not, probably believe that he's going to do a better job leading the country than what we've seen in the last 4 years.
I think that is what we're seeing because also in this poll that's just out this morning, when we asked people, what did you think about? What were your priorities heading into that voting booth? Far and away, the plurality of people, we asked them to choose two of a long list. You can find it on carolinajournal.com. But everyone, the majority of people, more than 60% of people chose prices and inflation and immigration. So our poll throughout the year kind of alluded to that, if we felt like that's where people were going, and a few other issues like abortion, things like that, sort of bubbled up to those numbers. But in the end, it came down to prices and inflation.
There was a new option for one of the top issues, and that was threats to democracy, which wasn't previously asked. However, Donna, that polling at almost 31%. Why was that added to the poll, and what do you extrapolate from those numbers?
Sure. We decided that we really kind of went around and around about that, but we decided to add it because there at the end, in those closing days of the election, it seemed to be something that the Democrats were really honing in on as their takeaway for this election. So we wanted to get a sense of where people stood on it. And you're right, it came in at that third spot, which really surprised me. And if you look down the list, threats to free speech, crime and public safety, those things got single-digit response in our poll. So I was really surprised to see those things really didn't bubble up as much as inflation and prices and immigration and threats to democracy.
One thing that's up about 5 or so points from the October and September polls is abortion. We know that was a top issue for Democrats. They ran on that nationwide. I think if we look at the Electoral College and the way that things shook out in the election, Donna, Trump winning 7 of 7 swing states, I don't think it necessarily had the impact, but nevertheless, it's still something that Republicans are going to have to deal with now with control of the White House and Congress.
It is. I mean, I think it's important to note, because I think that message sort of got lost here in the election, that this issue is a state issue now. So it really has a greater impact when people are looking at, for example, their state legislature. And that message may not have gotten to all voters, but certainly in the next 4 years or so, they'll be seeing that is where that decision is going to be made.
Election integrity has been a top conversation. A lot of that started after the 2020 election cycle. And while most North Carolina voters, about 70% of them, feel pretty confident in the election cycle, Donna, there's still a pretty sizable group that say, well, maybe we don't necessarily trust everything that's going on. Maybe that's due to some of the things with the Supreme Court race that we're seeing, recounts, ballots being counted days after the election. What do those numbers look like?
Sure. So actually, the majority of people feel like that the election was they're confident that the election was free and fair. That's hitting about 69%, nearly 70% of people saying they feel confident in it. I think what we're seeing now with the election and the ballots and those things is kind of a data paperwork problem that certainly I think will have to be addressed. This is something that a lot of counties, counting some of these provisional ballots late into the process. We're going to see, of course, a recount in the Supreme Court race and a handful of recounts in the North Carolina General Assembly. I don't anticipate we see a race flip because of those recounts, but it is certainly raising questions. That said, 70% of people feel like this was a free and fair election. The only place where the Democrats in our poll had the highest number of those saying that they're not entirely confident it was free and fair at about 43%.
Well, would be, I think, contrary to what most folks would think. The whole election denying thing, is what we'll call it, has been tied to Trump and the Republicans. That's a very interesting trend to follow.
I did think that was interesting because you see that flip. But, in past polls, we've seen, not just ours, really nationwide, that idea that elections were not free and fair was much more tied to Republican voters. This time around, what we're finding is that Democrat voters in our poll are more likely to be, suspicious or at least not confident that it was free and fair. Sometimes it just means your candidate didn't win.
Absolutely. We've got more on this poll. We'll continue the conversation with Donna King from the Carolina Journal coming up right after this. It's 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at the roadways on this Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 519, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT, the Carolina Journal News Hour, tracking some statewide news this morning. The North Carolina General Assembly is now set to allocate an additional $227 million for disaster relief in portions of western North Carolina following the absolute and almost unbelievable devastation and destruction from Hurricane Helene. That brings the total state aid to over $1 billion in just over a month since the General Assembly started allocating funds. The funding, which is sourced from the state's $4.75 billion aptly named Rainy Day Fund, is earmarked for future legislative appropriations to address recovery needs. The House passed the bill on Tuesday. It was the Senate that worked on it yesterday, which also modifies the governor's powers, with the Senate again passing that legislation yesterday afternoon. Key provisions include $27 million for agricultural programs, $100 million in interest-free bridge loans for emergency water and wastewater repairs, as well as temporary waivers and extensions for development-related permits and public health measures. This bill also offers some public school flexibility and ensures staff compensation in some of those affected areas. It has now passed both chambers and is now on Governor Roy Cooper's desk for either a signature, a veto, or allowing it to come into law by not doing any actions with it for 12 days. We will track what the governor does with that, a likely veto if I had to guess and say what will happen, and then it will make its way back to the General Assembly in parts of early December for them to decide if they have the votes for a veto override. So additional hurricane relief, some additional changes to some gubernatorial appointments. We'll have more details on that coming up a little bit later on this morning. It's now 5:21 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our discussion this morning on the most recent Carolina Journal poll post the 2024 election, the editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal, Donna King, continues with us this morning. Donna, as we continue down the poll and as we look kind of forward into other elections, there was an interesting question about primaries, which we saw were very contentious here, especially on the Republican GOP side of the aisle. What was the question there, and what did folks have to say about how happy were they with their primary candidates that then turned general election candidates?
Sure. We really wanted to get at the heart of whether this primary process seems to be working for North Carolinians. So wording some of these questions is one of the most challenging parts of doing these polls. In this case, it was, how satisfied are you that the party primary process produced the best candidate for the general election? So 46.2% said they were satisfied that their party's primary, gave them the best candidate. But 43% said they were dissatisfied, and 10% were unsure. So, it's kind of midway. It shows that people are more satisfied than less, but certainly, it's not a majority. It's not a, vast majority of people. There certainly might be some room there that people want to really start looking at their primary process and see, if it's working for them.
I would argue specifically on the Democrat side, Donna, you and I have talked about this in the past. Democrats typically do a pretty good job at clearing the fields in their primaries. I would imagine if you were a Democrat voter that was hyper involved, that would probably be pretty frustrating to you that you essentially don't have a choice in a lot of these statewide races.
That is true. And, because it makes it very difficult to, get into the process and to get into that primary, because Democrats are very good at clearing the field for a chosen candidate. And, often that candidate has been pre-selected by the powers that be in the party. That said, Republicans, kind of everybody get in the pool process is expensive. And you end up with these, very expensive primaries that then don't leave as much money for the general. And that makes it harder as well. So, there's definitely downsides to both methods.
Well, there was a lot of talk before the election about the Mark Robinson effect on down ballot candidates. You asked a question, however, as you just noted, you had to word things very carefully to get answers. What exactly was the question that the pollsters asked in this most recent Carolina Journal poll, and what were some of those responses?
Sure. Yeah, the wording is very difficult because Mark Robinson did end up walking away with 40% of the votes. There are a significant number of Republican, Democrat, independent voters who cast their ballot for Mark Robinson. But we wanted to see how the news cycle of his candidacy and everything that went along with it impacted down ballot candidates. So something we talked about a lot going into the election. The question was, to what extent did your assessment of Mark Robinson, the Republican candidate for governor of North Carolina, influence your decision to vote against other Republican candidates for other statewide offices like lieutenant governor and attorney general? So 46% said not at all, didn't impact it at all. But you got to remember that that 46% includes folks who may not have been opting to vote for Robinson with or without those news stories. So the one that we're really looking at is this 24.4% of respondents said it impacted it a great deal. And that means that it was a factor when they walked in. Perhaps they were thinking they were going to vote for him and then decided not to, or they were going to vote for him and decided that it was the right thing to do and they did anyway. But it was a greater factor for 24.4%. That's nearly a quarter of the voters in this survey. So I do think that that is worth noting in this.
Yeah, and we saw some of those close races, like in your question, lieutenant governor and attorney general, that only came down to a couple of points. And if 24% of voters said, hey, Robinson being above them had an impact, Donna, we could be looking at a very different picture here in North Carolina post-election if this was not the case necessarily.
It could be, because we'll get more time to look at the crosstabs in this poll. This is certainly fresh out of the field here. It was in the field as recently, I believe, as like Tuesday. So we're going to be looking more at this. But with 46.9% of people saying it didn't impact it at all, you got to remember that those folks may not have been in the Robinson camp in the first place. But that 24.4% saying it impacted it a great deal, they may have been.
Our largest voting bloc in the state of North Carolina continues to be unaffiliated voters, which is a tough nut to crack for both Republicans and Democrats as they try and figure out, first of all, who are these people? How do we message them and convince them to vote with our candidates? There was a question in there about partisan voting behavior. What was that, and what were some of the responses there?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do too. Figure out who these voters are, because they are more and more people, particularly in younger generations, are registering unaffiliated. And I think that that's important because, one, it may mean that they just want to be kind of off the radar of both parties. They don't want to, affiliate themselves or identify as a particular party, and they want to vote the candidates or just the issues. So it is interesting. In this case, it was thinking about who you vote for in elections. Which of the following do you agree with most? I consistently vote for candidates from one party. I generally support one party, but occasionally select others, or I choose candidates from multiple parties. 47, the largest number, 47.5% of people say, I generally support one party, but occasionally select candidates from other parties. So it is very interesting. Only 20% say that they sort of, go by the race and choose candidates from multiple different parties. So we are seeing that those unaffiliated voters tend to lean one direction or another. And that's why those crosstabs are so important that you can find on carolinajournal.com. But they are willing to cross the aisle on certain races.
Well, and I think that kind of showed itself on Election Day when we saw the Council of State essentially being a mix and match of both Democrats and Republicans. So, Don, I guess this poll is proving that, in fact, these voters do exist, regardless of what folks want to think otherwise.
No question. I mean, North Carolina's Council of State went from a 6-4 lean conservative, more Republicans, 6 Republicans, 4 Democrats. This time around, we have 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans on the Council of State. And that is key going into the next 4 years with Josh Stein being the governor. He's going to have half of his Council of State, including himself, be Democrats.
Unless you had been living under a rock for the last couple of months, television advertising, mail, text messages, emails, phone calls, people knocking on your door, Donna, you could not get away from the political election cycle. However, there was a question on this poll about what played the largest factor in determining your vote. The response to that was highly interesting.
It was to me, too. I'm glad you brought that one up. So we said, among the following options, which played the largest factor in determining your vote for 2024? The options were immediate family, friends, media, personal research, campaign outreach, would mean like mailers and people knocking on your door and, all that kind of thing. 77.6% said personal research. And I found that really interesting. I think it's encouraging, certainly, that people are, taking that responsibility, that civic duty, and doing some research before they go cast their ballots. But 77.6% seems really high. I don't know what research they're doing. Certainly, I imagine they're going to candidates' websites. They're going to perhaps their party of choice, those sheets that you get when you walk in and say, okay, here's the slate that we want you to vote. I do think it's really interesting. They're probably going to their parties, going to the candidate sites. And I do think it's encouraging that they're not just relying on ads and that kind of thing.
Donna, thanks for the time this morning. A lot of great information. You can read more on our poll by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. And that poll will be available at noon Eastern time today, again, over on our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We're off to a great...
It's 5:35. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are streaming live this morning, as always, on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Got some folks hanging out in the chat there. You can also check out our podcast by opening your favorite podcast app and searching for the Carolina Journal News Hour or WBT.com and click on the podcast tab. We are tracking breaking news this morning out of North Carolina. The Office of Recovery and Resiliency. This group was spun up in 2018 to deal with distributing and the recovery in eastern North Carolina from Hurricane Matthew and Florence. Earlier this week, it was the head of that group, Laura Hogshead, that was in front of a House committee in the North Carolina General Assembly giving an update on continued financial issues within the department. And we now know that Laura Hogshead apparently is no longer employed by the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, under which the Office of Recovery and Resiliency, NCORR, was located. That's according to details from the department's Chief Communication Officer, Jody Donaldson, in an announcement late yesterday. Donaldson said that Pryor Gibson, who was also at that hearing and works directly for Governor Roy Cooper, will be serving as the interim director of that office. It was a brutal hearing that took place earlier this week. We talked about that in great detail Tuesday morning. You can check out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast on Tuesday if you missed any portion of that. A fiery hearing, one of many in regards to the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. We are, again, now learning this morning, Laura Hogshead, the head of that group, is now gone, and we'll see what comes of that. And again, who is going to be handling the cleanup for Western North Carolina? That was one of the main questions that was asked during that hearing, was who do we trust and who exactly should be responsible for the West. We heard a little bit of that from Representative Jones, Representative Brandon Jones, out of portions of Columbus County. Take a listen.
Why would we give you the West? That's my recommendation to this committee, that we don't give it. You guys are like a comedy of errors. It's the same thing each time you come in here. Hey, we've screwed up. When are you going to get it right? I mean, we've given you every opportunity. We've given you every tool you've asked for. I mean, if you were a business coming to my bank asking for money, I certainly wouldn't loan you anything, because you've proven that you do not have the capability of being trusted with the taxpayers' money. So I'm just asking you, would you trust you? Would you let you go forward? Pryor, I'm like you, man. It's my people. Those are my people out of their homes. But at the end, if you want to carry it up to the chain to the governor, y'all have failed miserably. There's no reason we're where we're at today. This should have been wrapped up. And we've given you every opportunity and gave you every dollar you've ever asked for. And it's going to be hard for this committee to swallow and go back to our respective chambers and ask for this money. No one has any more sympathy or empathy for the people of this state that are affected by the storms than I do. I have to live with them every day. You don't have to go to the food line and sit there and hold them while they're crying because they're not in their house. You don't have an 80-year-old come to your business because he's living in a mold-infested house. You don't have to do that. I do. John Bell does. Brent Jackson does. Buck Newton does. You don't. You say you care, but you certainly haven't shown it.
Certainly hadn't shown it. Those comments there from Representative Brandon Jones. Again, the director of NCORR, Laura Hogshead, is out as of this morning. Breaking news. We'll continue to track that throughout the day over at carolinajournal.com. 539, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the administrator of that, Deanne Criswell, was grilled earlier this week at a Congressional Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee hearing. That took place on Tuesday morning about claims that the government agency wasn't doing enough to help those impacted by Hurricane Helene, of course, in western North Carolina, and on the west coast of Florida for Hurricane Milton. Representative Rick Larson from Washington State pointed out, among other problems, 11,000 applications have been approved for small businesses affected by the hurricanes. However, as we've talked about, funds for the Small Business Administration are currently depleted and have been so since last month. Also, the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund is approaching concerningly low levels with less than $5 billion remaining. The discussion was at the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management hearing. Larson asked for House Speaker Mike Johnson to schedule a vote for Congress to consider President Joe Biden's $100 billion disaster supplement request that has been rumored to come forward that would provide additional money to FEMA and additional money to the Small Business Administration, the SBA. We don't necessarily have a timeline on when that is going to happen yet. In addition to that, Larson said he also supports some other representatives' bills to create a universal application. This has been a big one. A universal application for federal disaster assistance, which would ease the process for those survivors. Apparently, the paperwork is grueling to go through. There's so much government bureaucracy and red tape associated with that. He also said that he was troubled by reports that 47% of calls made to FEMA during the week of October the 14th through October the 20th were not answered. Almost 50% of the phone calls were not answered, and more than 260,000 survivors who registered with FEMA assistance, nearly 50% of them have been denied. We also heard some comments from Congressman Chuck Edwards talking about the devastation out west. This is what he had to say earlier this week up in Congress.
FEMA's core responsibility is to coordinate federal emergency management efforts and support state and local officials with critical resources. It seemed to me and many local officials in Western North Carolina that it took up to 3 days before there was any real visibility from FEMA. And that's just simply not good enough. Allow me to put this in perspective. The storm was over on September 27th for all practical purposes at about 10 a.m. We had 1 million people without power. We had 25 water systems destroyed. And for it to take 3 days for the visibility of FEMA is just not acceptable. There were folks in their homes not only without power, they couldn't flush toilets, they had no drinking water. We were shut off from the rest of the world. And I can't help but think, had this been an attack on American soil, should it take 3 days to see any real evidence of help from our federal government? I would hope not. The distribution of supplies in the immediate aftermath of Helene left much to be desired. For example, on day 3 after the storm, FEMA announced to me that it had delivered 400 pallets of desperately needed water to Western North Carolina. But when asked where those supplies had been delivered, FEMA couldn't provide one single location. They deferred responsibility to the state, which left local officials in the dark about where resources were going and who could also not answer my simple question. A major concern in my district was FEMA's slow response in getting boots on the ground in some areas. For example, in one county, FEMA didn't arrive until over a week after the storm. And it wasn't until 20 days later that a disaster recovery center was opened. In addition, FEMA's communication with local governments and the public was inconsistent and at times confusing. On one occasion, FEMA sent out a press release stating that a disaster recovery center would close temporarily without informing local officials, only to retract it hours later after confusion, numerous inquiries, and local demands. Other failures include FEMA personnel changes with little or no notice to county governments, no-shows for scheduled appointments, issuing hotel vouchers to displaced families that could only be redeemed 2 hours from those displaced families' work or school, an inefficient inspection process that slows consideration of critical benefits, and the 50% threshold for substantial improvement and substantial damage definitions and their required actions are riddled with inconsistencies and irrational thinking.
That's North Carolina Congressman Chuck Edwards out of the 11th Congressional District in North Carolina testifying in front of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee earlier this week Of course, some of the other controversy with FEMA continues to be the fact that they ignored homes both in Florida and in western North Carolina that had Trump signs in their yards. We'll have details on that coming up here in just a few minutes. It's now 5:45, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get another look at the roadways on this Thursday morning. Boomer Von Cannon's got the latest.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Northwest.
It's 5:50. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Keeping our attention this morning up in Washington, D.C., there was a meeting earlier this week in which the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, was in front of Transportation and Infrastructure, a subcommittee of that organization, being grilled by congressional representatives on both sides of the political aisle over what has been deemed missteps and, in many cases, mismanagement of FEMA in the responses not only in western North Carolina, but in portions of Florida dealing with Hurricane Milton. One of the stories that has come to light over the last couple of weeks is about a former FEMA employee that said that she was told to skip houses with Trump campaign signs that were in their yards, not only in Florida, but also in western North Carolina. Her name is Marnie Washington. She was that former FEMA worker who has since been fired after a text chain was leaked showing her instructing colleagues to, quote, avoid houses that had Trump signs in their yard. She told that to the Daily Mail as well as a couple of YouTube shows, one being Roland Martin. And she claims that FEMA is lying about the scandal and making her a scapegoat of a wider practice. Florida Congressman Byron Donalds asked a question about that to the FEMA administrator earlier this week. This is what he had to say.
So, Administrator Criswell, you told me at the beginning of this questioning that there is nothing in your policies that would dictate that this is to occur. Yet you have one official who was fired who said it does occur. You have another official under your purview, under the condition of anonymity, talking to the press that it does occur. But you can't verify to this committee that these practices do or do not occur. Is that correct?
I have been given no evidence and seen no indication that this goes beyond this one incident. If you have specific information, I would welcome that.
Are you prepared to turn over the communiques between your supervisors and their field representatives and upper-level management at FEMA to this committee?
We always cooperate with Congress on the information that they request, and we will continue to cooperate throughout this.
So you're prepared to turn over all those
We
communications?
are prepared to support requests for information to help support the ongoing investigation into this.
Chairman, I would move that it's clear that the administrator is more than prepared to share all communications with the Oversight Committee about various communications with field volunteers, volunteer staff on the ground, supervisors at FEMA headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Also, for the record, Chairman, I move that the article that I talked about, this is not an isolated incident, be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
That's Representative Byron Donalds up in Washington, D.C. He represents portions of the west coast of Florida around the Fort Myers, Naples area. He, of course, bringing up these stories that have been talked about in great detail over the last couple of weeks. Again, Deanne Criswell, the lead of FEMA, testifying that FEMA helps all survivors and that she was concerned when she heard about this apparent directive to ignore individuals that were voting for Donald Trump and had Trump paraphernalia in their yards or flags hanging from their homes, saying that it was not a practice that FEMA followed. There will likely be more investigations into this. We'll see and keep an eye on that right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. In some other top news this morning, the North Carolina General Assembly is set to provide an additional $227 million to assist communities in western North Carolina in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. That third round of disaster relief funding was introduced this week up in Raleigh as the General Assembly has been back. It passed the House on Tuesday, passed the House yesterday, and now sits on Governor Roy Cooper's desk, where he will decide whether to approve, sign the legislation into law, veto it, and send it back to the General Assembly for a potential veto override, or a third option in which he could allow the legislation to what we call sit on his desk. If it does so for 12 days, it will become law without a signature. The latest legislation would transfer $227 million from the state's savings reserve, or what is known as the Rainy Day Fund, which, by the way, has a large amount of money available, some $4.75 billion in savings specifically for emergencies like we've seen out in western North Carolina to fund disaster recovery efforts out in the West. Again, the House passed that bill earlier this week, the Senate on yesterday. In two previous October legislative sessions, the legislature provided $644 million in one round of relief and $273 million in another round of relief, that back last month. And though this week's funding is allocated for disaster reliefs, Critics note that the money will not immediately go to use. Rather, the money will remain unspent and will be allocated throughout subsequent legislative sessions and actions to continue to address recovery needs. The legislation reads like this, quote, "The fund shall remain unspent until appropriated by an act of the General Assembly. It is the intent of the General Assembly to review funding and to consider actions needed to address remaining unmet needs." Inside the bill, $27 million is earmarked for the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. The agency will direct $25 million to the Stream Flow Rehabilitation Assistance Program, which focuses on debris removal from waterways to mitigate future flooding risks and environmental hazards. We know that's going to be a big deal out west, as well as an additional $2 million will be used to support soil and water conservation districts in some of those affected areas. To alleviate financial strains on local governments, the bill also establishes a bridge loan program for emergency water and wastewater repairs, which right now, and this could be changed, but right now it's capped at $100 million. Those loans are interest-free and must be repaid within 5 years. As we look at the infrastructure mess out west, water systems are one of the main things. It takes a very long time to get wastewater treatment and clean drinking water facilities up and operational. Some of those systems could take 2 to 3 years to get back online. So the General Assembly offering some of this money interest-free for some of these local communities. Will continue to track that. Aside from financial aid, the bill also provides flexibility for various industries on the road to recovery. Public schools in those affected areas can change their calendars. There's a whole bunch in there as well. You can read more details on our website, carolinajournal.com. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. We're back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m., right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.